We can't make time. Can we make time for philosophy, or can't we? Did Kant make time? How much does our implicit philosophy about time structure and organize our lives? How much of this implicit philosophy can we restructure? Or is it better to say it, time structures us? What does it mean to make time for philosophy? How much does that endeavor require or move from a serious reckoning with our own preconceptions about what time is? I'll often be told how refreshing it is when I engage with the philosophical curiosities of people I meet. They will acknowledge how important it is, how important ideas are in general, and in terms of how they shape our individual and social reality, how they inform our very movements in and through the world. But just as quickly as a fresh contemplative breath is taken, it is blown off with some platitude about practicalities as cause for disengaging the budding inquiry. There's no time for it. Indeed, philosophy is a precious and often precarious thing. We burn so hot with our passions and ideas, or we look at our toes with apathy while standing before a great horizon. Almost beside ourselves, or in spite of ourselves, we snuff out and piss on the inklings of philosophy before it is allowed to take between us. We, in general, take little to no care to schedule it into our lives. What even is it? And when we drop a pondering that is in some way special to ourselves in front of others, it is often with a kind of embarrassment. The pondering meets the fate of a seed fallen on concrete. This is all cause for compassion, of course. A philosopher engenders others, as Thomas reflected this week. We do not quite know what to do with the impulse that has us spontaneously pondering the nature of time or space. That disposition has not been nurtured in us by a friend of wisdom. We have not been introduced to the great conversation. Yet, we cannot help but posit our good and imply our philosophy in the meandering of our lives. We who are talking today have been afforded, we have been cared for, such that we recognize and value inquiry, and in that mutual recognition, we seek to make time for it amongst ourselves, recognizing more and more that we need help along the way. What we will reflect here are some of the challenges that we face in doing so, in making time for philosophy. This more practical reflection might, in a peculiar way, begin to press us back into the contemplation of time itself. So, today, as a kind of interlude to this series, before we pick up more methodically Kant's critique of pure reason, we pause for a moment to reflect on the very act of making time for philosophy. Can we make time for it or can't we? And how much of philosophy is a collective effort? And how do we even approach a text like the Critique of Pure Reason? And simply, did Kant make time? Okay, very mooi. Does that provoke any initial directions? I don't think we'll go in an order. There's three of us, vandaag.
Yeah, so we've been reading, this is somewhat unrelated to Kant, but in one of the seminars we've been doing with Dr. Bryant, we've been reading W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk. And I don't have the text with me at the moment, but there's a couple of passages that he talks about. And he speaks about the difficulty of thinking together in terms of races, because that's what he's interested in an era where it is increasingly difficult to sit down with a person, have a cup of coffee, smoke a cigar, and talk about ideas. Now, this is a text written in the early 1900s. I can't remember what the date was. But how much harder is it to do it now, right? With increasing deadlines, increasing sort of monitoring of workflows, and sort of a higher increase in sort of practical efforts. Everybody is involved in multiple aspects of work life, and everybody has multiple roles or multiple functions, which I'm aware that people had before. I just think that the monitoring of it that we can now be afforded due to technology, cell phones, email, etc., has made it all the more intense. And for some reason, your conversation made me, it like knocked something loose in my brain. And the thing that it knocked loose was, what conception of time do we work with today? Or rather, how are we conceiving time on a day to day basis? And has the shape of time changed due to our technological advances, our sociological advances, and these sorts of factors? So we start off speaking about Kant. And for Kant, it's really interesting because the reversal that takes place is the relocation of time from something that exists apart from us, right? Time as something that we as human beings are subject to, and the rest of the world is as well, to a fundamental form of our representation. Rather than being simply subject to time, we, in a sense, make time, right? We order the world in which we experience in terms of things like simultaneity and succession, cause and effect, if this, then that, not now, but then, right? So that reversal is really interesting because it places a sort of new ability within the subject. Like the silly example that I've been giving my classes when I TA sometimes when some Kantian idea comes up is calendarizing or diarizing. Like, what does the act of diarizing mean? Like, you set down a date and a time and you write, today I'm going to talk about philosophy with Dan and Tom or something like that. And then you shape your day around the events that you've placed there. And in a very fundamental way, it might seem that these lower order actions have no impact. But think about higher order actions, right? You guys are talking about Aristotle's politics. Imagine the planning of a statesperson or something like that. Like the amount of administration and organization that has to go into shaping the state of the city and shaping the general culture of the world that we have around us is immense. And something as simple as the diary or the calendar is, I think, a really good expression of the subjective time that Kant brings into play. That we really do, in a silly way, I guess, organize the world in terms of these categories of time. And so I'm just wondering whether the time has come for a new conception of time and whether looking back toward an older rethinking of time through Kant's reconceptualization is a key to figuring out what sense of time we work with today and what time means for us. Is time the practical thing that those people that you stop and talk with in the streets are affected by, which exists outside of them? Is it something that they believe is within their control or that they are not completely subject to but exist beyond and apart from in a timeless manner? Or, you know, is it something completely different? Is it a doubly determining factor that somehow influences both us and the world in weird and mysterious ways? I don't have answers to these questions. It's just where your thoughts initially pushed me.
Mm. Yeah, that's
I,
rich. I appreciate.
I took it is. I think it is difficult in this day. I think I always take a historical view, and I always think that often complaints against an age are that an age is unphilosophical seem to me to be. I can't help but feel it's like, I don't know if you've heard that you can read have you seen that it's like a meme now almost of like some guy complaining in Akkadian about the children today have no manners. I don't know if
Yeah,
you've
sure.
seen that. It is but I think, and what I'm trying to say is, I think the struggle to create time for philosophy is perennial.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was a struggle in Plato's time as much and now as it is, because of the desires of the desires of our bodies, the need to make money, all of these things. I think maybe we might be living in an age where it's harder to articulate the value of philosophy. So therefore, it's even harder to make time, not only in relation to others, but in relation to ourselves. It can be harder because you've got a much more a society and a view, the sort of general view that our culture has is less spiritual, to put it bluntly. It makes less room for the spirit and is more obviously materialistic. And so the life of the mind and the life of a spiritual thing is which I think philosophy almost intrinsically is. It's always about speaking about those things we can't really speak about, or speaking about things like the mind. Seems to lie outside our day-to-day experience, and that's why people today will say, or at any time will say, "What's the practical value of this?" I can't really do anything with what you're saying, and I think that the urgency with which they speak, in the tenor, their tone has become a bit harsher, I think. I don't know. I might be wrong. Maybe you have a different experience.
No, not at all, actually. The perennial comment that you made is really useful, and we'll see it pop up in the preface next week when we read Kant.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he says something like, "Our age, the Kantian age, whatever, is the age of the ripened power of judgment," and he characterizes his time as like criticizing religion, subjecting everything to reason, and just like throwing the old garbs of the medieval tradition sort of away in many ways. And he says that it's not due to the thoughtlessness of our age, but our ripened power of judgment, which will no longer be put off with these illusory appearances of knowledge. I think he says semblances or something like that. We'll see it next week when we read the text. And so, yeah, to some extent, it seems like there is this perennial theme running through where it's difficult to make time for philosophy, and also that there's a bunch of maybe pessimists that are like, this is an unphilosophical age. But perhaps it's not an unphilosophical age. Perhaps we're just being pessimistic. And it's actually hyper philosophical. We're just, not
Not
appreciating
seen.
that, which is always a possibility and always a danger, I think. The other thing that you talked about was the value of philosophy, and I thought that was really important. So, the value of philosophy is always really difficult, right? Um, it's really hard to approach it in a way that does it justice, because any value that you give it in terms of an end that it is for the sake of is going to subordinate it to that end, right? If you say that philosophy is for the sake of, I don't know, articulating yourself, or yeah, if it's for the sake of articulating yourself, or if it's to do better in your GREs, or if it's to do, to get the good grade, then the activity of philosophy fundamentally becomes subordinated to that end, right? I do philosophy so I can get the good grade, so I can appear pretentious and impress people, so I can XYZ, right? There are all these reasons that one might do philosophy. And the difficulty, I think, with initiating the love of philosophy or the love of wisdom into, I guess, the uninitiated, sounds so terrible to say, is
So elitist.
is giving them sort of an appreciation for an aimless aim, right? This end without end, this thing that we can pursue that has no sort of finality to itself, and nor is it for the sake of anything else. It is, in, I guess, maybe very old terms of thinking, that which other things are for the sake of, right? So all of the lower forms of knowledge, the lower forms of knowing or the forms of practice are oriented around some sort of unifying function, and philosophy might be a type of unifying function. I'm thinking more specifically about Plato and inquiry, right? We need an end to act towards. We don't know what the end is. The only end that we can act towards without harming ourselves is seeking our ends, is inquiry. And so we get a sort of surrogate end which to pursue. And so it's really difficult to to say that the value of philosophy is X, Y, or Z, because every time you identify a specific value for it, you've made it subordinate to something that's supposed to be subordinate to it. And just thinking in terms of Aristotle's metaphysics or something like that, he says that weird line that all philosophy begins in wonder, or and he talks about the priests and the people in sort of ancient Egypt starting to philosophize in leisure time, right? That like philosophy requires this leisure time to be able to step back, pause, and think about really what our thoughts are implementing or saying about the world. So it's like it's this double-edged sword of we need to be able to engage in this activity that seems to, by its very nature, have either no end or to be timeless, right? We need to make time for a timeless activity, which has value intrinsically, but not for the sake of anything else. And so there's a sort of double challenge that faces anybody that wants to convince somebody else of partaking in philosophy, that they need to make time for this, and it's got no benefit whatsoever. But that's precisely the benefit, is that it's not for the sake of it.
Well,
Right?
Wouldn't I mean it would have to at some level. I was going to say that it is interesting you bring up Plato.
Yeah.
Because I was going to say that I think in a strange way, this is my pet theory, and I'm open to it being refuted here, is that in some way the true shoemaker is philosophical about making shoes, and that what we're doing is being philosophical about philosophy. We're pursuing it for its own sake. The true shoemaker really wants to make you the best pair of shoes he can, and the true philosopher is and so in a weird way, everyone on the Platonic hierarchy, that idea of the philosopher at the top, has all those people immanent in them at the same time. It's one way of explaining it. I think this is one way of explaining it to people, is that you have this in you, and all I have to do is draw it out of you. Or that might be a model for creating the value of philosophy, or finding that, convincing person by person of the value of philosophy. And the other example was my own personal experience, is that of I read Roger Scruton's book on beauty, and it literally changed the way I looked at the world. It was like light came in. If I don't know how to describe it, but not light, obviously. I just noticed things more. Does that make sense? And
Yeah.
to be able to suddenly see more beauty in the world, that seems to me to be a valuable project. But you have to do that. You have to pursue beauty for its own sake. You have to pursue knowledge and beauty for its own sake, and then present that result to others. Those are my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, I think you're right to point out the sort of philosophical activity ongoing in the sort of subordinate forms, the shoemaker, the artisan, the craftsperson. All of them are doing some sort of knowing activity without being self-aware of their knowing activity. And Daniel's preliminary discussion, where the people that he meets on the street get really interested in this, it's because they have some sort of, fundamental drive, or some sort of philosophy it's not I want to say it's not special, it's not sacred, but I don't mean that in the way that it shouldn't be treated with dignity and respect, but I mean that it's something just more fundamentally human, right? And that it is within each of us to examine our ideas and to think about the world in certain ways. Like, we're confronted by this world, and we've got to navigate it somehow. And the navigation almost always takes its shape in terms of thinking, right? We have to, again, plan for the next day, or think about what we're going to eat, or think about the ways in which we should order our lives. Do I want to be a doctor when I grow up, or a nurse, or a grad student? Um,
I don't know.
yeah, exactly. Um, but so I think you're right to point out that there's this like potential to philosophize present. The difficulty is bringing that potential out without subordinating it to something else. It seems like you almost have to use something else in order to entice somebody to get interested in it. And then that needs to be used as sort of a stepping stone into pursuing philosophy for its own sake. Like, so teaching, again, we've been having discussion sections every Friday, and a lot of the students here are not taking philosophy because they want to take philosophy. They're taking it because they have to fulfill a credit requirement for their first year, and they are studying things like biology or economics or, you know, law, other really important subjects. And so there's always this difficulty of like, they come in, we start doing arguments, we start doing thinking about abstract concepts, and they're like, how does this relate to what I'm doing, right? How does this have any relevance? And it's finding those little ends of relevance when somebody is there to get them interested in what they're doing, or to show them how philosophy can maybe help them, that is important, but doing it in such a way, one has to be sly. Doing it in such a way that
Crafty.
it shows
Crafty.
them the value of something that is higher order. Not so that they, I don't know, become grad students, because that's its own issue, but just so that they can think about and reflect upon their own ideas, right? So we had the biology person in my class yesterday who barely speaks, and I was speaking to her before class, and we had been doing something like higher level inductions and deductive arguments and things like that. So higher level induction is where you use sort of a general observation, so an observation about cars as a category, to infer
Mhm.
something about a lower level, my Ford, for example. So I've observed that every car breaks down after a certain amount of use. My Ford hasn't broken down yet, but there's a pretty good chance it will, because all cars break down after some use, right?
Okay. How is that different from just an ordinary induction? Just
Um, in an enumerative induction would be an ordinary induction, and that would be from every particular case to the general. So I would observe my Ford running well, and this Nissan running well, and the Subaru running well, and make the inference to all cars run well, or something like that.
because
Right.
okay, so it's like different sets. Cars, if you think maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, we're working upwards towards a higher order category, or we're working downwards from a higher order category to some lower level. Anyways, to cut a long story short, her issue was that she couldn't see the philosophical impact, right? She said that biology was much easier because she could see, like, visibly, uh, with her eyes. Um,
Here's the frog's heart, whatever it is.
yeah, exactly. It's observable.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the sciences that work with induction, you can see what they're doing. It's observable, it's visible, and we can understand it in terms of this seeing is believing model, I guess, right? I can see how the heart functions, so I must believe how the heart functions that way, because that's what sight confirms. But I mean, and I don't think it's necessarily right to frame philosophy in this way, but if you want to look at it as a sort of higher order induction, you could go from the lowest concepts, the most particular things, the frog and the heart, to something higher order, like the study of animals and living beings, to something higher order, the study of thought and
Studies.
consistency, or the study of studies, right? And so, in that way, whatever applies to that first science, so to speak, um, will also apply to the lower order sciences, right? So, I don't know, we can't have contradictions in biology. And contradiction, or the principle of non contradiction, seems to be a principle that belongs to the domain of philosophy, or at least logic. Um, And so by
Which
by giving them a way in to see how this very abstract higher order thing, and abstract might be the wrong word here, um, it can influence a sort of lower order concrete being, is, I think, really a worthwhile in. And I think in terms of the communal effort, Dan, that we were speaking about, um, and I'd love to hear you speak more about this because I think you've been involved with different types of communities. But what's so valuable about community, I think, especially like a classroom, is interruption. Like,
sorry, stop you there.
thank you. But no, the thoughts interrupt, man. Like, you get really caught up in your own head a lot. At least I do. And sometimes you'll be thinking something and maybe it's not right, but there's no like point of interruption for yourself. Like, maybe you say, no, I don't really think that's right, but you don't have the words to articulate it, or you don't have the courage to stick with it, or you don't have somebody to cheer you on and go, yeah, that sounds really like, stay with it, stay more.
You're
Uh,
insane.
yeah, exactly. Like a you're insane every once in a while does tend to help. Sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. But yeah, I don't know. We've been reading again The Souls of Black Folk by Du Bois, and it's been really nice to read it in a class context. Sometimes really annoying because people can distract in different ways. Interruption is not always positive, but there's some interruptions that are. Um, and so you'll spit an idea out that you've had, and then nobody will have had that idea, or somebody will have had something similar but different to it. And you can use those as contrastives to figure out, is this actually what the text is saying? Is it not what the text is saying? How does this influence your life? And how are you thinking about this? I mean, The Souls of Black Folk is very practical for somebody who is a person of color, right? It's an issue of race, and so how some of the students that aren't people of color in the class are thinking about race is going to be very different from how I approach it, or how Douglas, who's an African American, approaches it, or how Shagun, who's from India, approaches it. So having these like interruptions, and these repeated interruptions, as well as the uh, cheerleading, like being like, you gotta flesh this out, like this is yours, is so valuable because I think Dr. Bryant really showed me this last semester. I had come in from Rhodes, and we had like a very specific kind of education, I think, and that was really good in many aspects, but it also closed off doors to certain ideas and certain forms of thinking and certain ways of thinking, like thinking without certainty, or thinking without a banister, or you know, uh,
Thinking without a banister. What does that mean?
thinking without a banister. It's a Hannah Arendt title actually, but she's interested in like just starting from like nowhere almost. And just working through stuff. Sometimes like we we are all, at least in my experience, we're all taken by this like there's a highest good to aim at. We all have these subordinate goods, and philosophy is, the queen of the sciences, which all the other sciences fall under, which is not popular anymore and maybe not right. It's a position that has to be argued for. And there are other positions about this view. Um, so Bryant has been interesting because we were talking about like prophecy and insight and like religion. Um, and she's generally like
Sorry,
quite
I'm about to
mystical.
sneeze.
Bless you.
Like as you went religion, I'm like trying to.
No, she's just
Yeah.
quite mystical in terms of like her reading choices, and she chooses these very powerful readings that are very unlike anything I've ever read before. Um, like Simone Weil, we read a paper by Simone Weil, the sister of the French mathematician Andrew Weil, I guess. She was a philosopher. And she wrote this paper on emancipation of like the working class, I guess. And it was really weird to just think about like the very concrete social relations that make up the laboring class and their relation to, I guess, the uh, ruling political class, and how we can provide some sort of liberation to them. Her answer was through God and beauty. Um, but regardless of whatever her answer was, just coming down from the thinking about thinking or conceptualizing time to something much more on the ground and rooted in our worldly relationships with one another is very different, but also affords philosophical approach, right? Sometimes we don't need to be thinking about thinking. Sometimes we need to be thinking about what on earth we're doing here, right? Like,
Sometimes
what's
we
the
go down
relationship?
into the prayers.
Yeah, it's like, do we get caught up in our own thoughts about things, and do we always try to reach for the highest point, or is there something to thinking the initial practical stuff that happens, and having
Thinking the possible.
yeah, and I mean, it's been very strange. This is getting way off topic, but I'll continue for a little bit. So we've been reading Hannah Arendt, and we read her text on revolution, and she's such a powerful philosopher, but such a weird philosopher at the same time. She in On Revolution, she just talks about the French Revolution and the American Revolution like throughout the texts, and uses these historical events to draw really profound philosophical conclusions. And I guess maybe what I meant to say with that interruption that happens in class, and what I meant to bring up with Dr. Bryan's sort of freedom in thought, is like, with what must thinking begin, right? We're always like looking for these foundations with people like Descartes or Kant, or like modern philosophy has this project of finding foundations, of working back to the beginning and then starting from some secure starting point, and that's where we derive everything from. Whether it be the I think that can accompany everything else for Kant, or Descartes' certainty that leads us to God eventually, from which we can see everything clearly. Um, those sorts of starting points, that working backwards towards the beginning and working downwards from it, is very different. Like Plato, you can think of the character of Socrates. Where does Socrates start, right? He walks around on the street or something, or he's in the courtroom, and then Euthyphro's there trying to bring his dad in for murdering a murderer, and then Socrates is like, "Yo, what are you doing, man? Like, why are you charging
Ambushing.
that?" So, in that sense, like the question that Bryant has raised for me on several occasions is, what do we begin with? Like, philosophy is such a rich practice that it seems like its jumping point is anywhere, right? We can start by talking about the French Revolution or the American Revolution and take this historical approach, or we can study organisms as Aristotle might do for thinking about different sorts of souls in De Anima, like the plant soul and the animal soul. Um, like, where do we get our premises from? Like, we just, there are some things that we just observe, right? And what we pay attention to is going to be largely informed by the type of person that we are, right? There's going to be other influencing factors, but what you focus on in a text is going to be different from what I find interesting, I think. Um, there'll be certain like overlaps that have to be there for the text to have structure, like the overall argument of the text. But beyond that, really, they're your ideas, and the onus is on you to explore them. And the interruption is useful because it can, like I said to Dan earlier, that his speech on time knocked something loose in my mind. And that's kind of what the interruption feels like. It feels like there's like an idea that's like become stuck, or like has like hardened or calcified over time, and that like the interruptions are like means of chipping away, right? Like, or like loosening up. um yeah, just reshaping one's thoughts and
I was
allowing
gonna
them
say,
to.
sorry, just Hadley, I was gonna say it's something the interruptions or the necessity of others in this and community to bring it back to some of the themes that were in Dan's and in your speech now. You know, I've been obsessed a bit by rhetoric, and one of the texts that I've obsessed with about that is the Gorgias, and at the end, towards the end of the Gorgias, there's this. Remember, what's his name? Thrasymachus. He's a bit like Thrasymachus, though his name is Callicles. And Socrates has a debate with about whether it's better to be just or to live, whether it is better to suffer injustice or commit injustice. Anyway, cut a long story short, there's a whole point about dialectic in there, about you need a person to have a conversation with about these matters, who is frank, knowledgeable, and who cares about you. And what I think, this is just my speculation here. If you think he ends up not needing Callicles in the end, surprisingly, he just goes into divine inspiration by himself to find the resolution to the problem. But it makes me think of the Meno problem. You somehow don't know what you don't know, and having someone come in who maybe does know or makes you aware that you don't know, at least with a kind of spur, as you say, a knocking out of showing a shining of light. I don't know if that's where your guys' thought is headed. It's just something that has sort of rolled around in my head, that those two are, because those two texts, also the Meno talks a lot about Gorgias and rhetoric. For such a short text, mentions him quite a bit. Anyway, sorry, that's enough from me. Dan, do you want to?
Yeah, maybe let me I mean, even like starting to speak now, and just on like the tail end of themes that came up on the tail end of what you both just said, like the question might be like, what do I care for right now? Like, what do I like? Where? So it's similar to the question of like a beginning, or a beginning from nowhere, or a beginning from anywhere, like a beginning on the fly. Like, what is that prompt or that gesture that engenders philosophy? Like what is the thing cared for that then like this ignites the track, or it puts us on the tail of something. I don't know, like it moves us towards this thing. And what am I caring for in that moment? Like that might be a I mean, I took notes in the beginning a little bit, but that might be just a question to pose. I don't know if there's enough flesh on it, but like in that initiatory gesture, like what am I caring
There's
for?
there's plenty of meat on the bones, Dan. Right. I think the question has maybe been approached in many ways, right? And maybe there's many more ways to approach it. The what am I caring for question when I am spurred on by someone. I think it can also maybe be, and I don't want to put words into your mouth, but it can also maybe be phrased as something like, what is knowledge? That very big question. Like, what are we gathered around and what are we working towards? And so when I said it's been answered in many ways, uh, we can think about knowledge as some sort of um, entity or intrinsic thing that exists apart from us, towards which we're approaching, some sort of thing that we all gather around to look at and observe, and then sort of track down and articulate the truth for ourselves. So something that has to be there in order for us to even engage in the very activity that we are gathering around. That's, I guess, one of the ways to look at it, and I think maybe a very sort of ancient way, or a sort of older way, that like truth is somehow there and we need to like grasp it. The reality of being reveals itself through the act of knowing, or something like that. But there's different ways of approaching the question. I'm thinking of been doing a reading group with a bunch of friends on Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. And he talks about the philosopher, and he says that every like philosophical first principle has come around by some human, all too human act of generalizing uh, from some like meager premise to like some like wild conclusion, right? Like the existence of the soul as a simple substance or something like that. He says is concluded from the sort of grammar of I am thinking about this or something like that. And so, since the I has to have something to think, we believe that the I is a substance and the thinking or the thing that it's thinking about is an accident that belongs to it. But really, that's just the grammar of the sentence that deceives us, right? Um, is what he says, I think, in that example specifically. And so,
Mm.
there it just seems like what's pushing us towards this knowledge making activity, or what knowing is some fundamentally human activity, just what we do, right? It's like how the bird flies or how the fish swims. It's just what it is to be human, is to do these knowledge making activities. And so in that way, knowledge seems to become as a sort of social construction in some sense, like something that we are all gathered around and building together, as if though, it was some monument that we were leaving behind to the world. But it's not social constructivist in the sense that it's arbitrary, but it's due to what we are. It's part of our, one might say, self-expression of our nature or something like that. So yeah,
Mm.
there's different ways of approaching the questions, and the different ways of approaching the question are important because they shine a different light on the togetherness of the activity that we're doing. Are we gathered around in a circle watching the spectacle for the first time and then trying to articulate and record that spectacle for other people? Or are we just artistically creating things, just making better and better accounts up, like as if though we were myth making, right? Telling stories. So that also raises, I guess, adjacent questions of what is the knowledge making process? Who is allowed to be involved in the knowledge making process? And sometimes I think the strict sort of we are gathered around this being, observing it and tracking it down, watching it reveal itself to us, can sometimes be, I think it might be more true, maybe, but sometimes it can get in the way of actually getting stuff started, right? So one of the things that, again, discussion sections and working with Dr. Bryant has been very important is just that if we take this constructivist view or something like that, then it opens up a space for everybody to theorize, right? You might want to ask, should everybody theorize? I don't know. That's a secondary question that might need to be addressed.
Mm.
But at least to some extent, I think offering a hand out is the best way to
A
do.
good thing.
Yeah, like just opening up opportunities to theorize. Again, we're reading. Wow, this text has apparently been super powerful and influential for me. Again, we're reading Du Bois's uh, the Souls of Black Folk, and in
Yeah.
the opening paragraphs in of um, the striving of the souls or something it's called, he says something like he's discussing the race problem, and race is conceived of in terms of nationality. Uh, and the nationality problem is that he's African, he's from Africa, but he's in America. So these two nationalities are in contention with one another. Anyways, he has this opening set of sentences about how people now approach him in the street and ask him all sorts of questions like, how do you feel about the change in the education system in Georgia or something like that? Or do you think that like you could be a good worker? All of these sorts of like questions that people of different races might ask a person of color. Like, is he a good worker? Or like, how do you feel about, someone might ask me, like one of my friends messaged me in a very worried state a few weeks ago And they were like, how does it feel about Trump being president now? And it's like, I don't know, it feels normal, relatively. Like the political situation seems to be much the same where I am at, but I'm sure it's much different around the entirety of America. Anyways, Du Bois says something like, all these people that ask him this question are flitting around this problem and they don't have sort of the courage to articulate it. And the problem is, how does it feel to be a problem? How the situation of being an African American? Like, how does it feel to be a contradiction? Like to have these inner
Or
sides
I
work.
wonder,
And
it's
just
like,
to finish,
yeah.
sorry, Thomas. I think the real value of that was I had never heard something like that articulated before. And maybe as like a person of color, I had always felt that, right? And like this feeling of how does it feel to be a problem, like looming large, but not having the words to get the grunt out of my mouth to like say it or speak it into the world. And I think maybe that's the value, right? We all have these like grunt like expressions that can be refined and articulated with clarity. And those are valuable for their own sake, but also for the sake of others. Like Du Bois is articulating this for himself and articulating this for the African Americans that existed at that time. But there's resonances across the board. And just hearing somebody or just seeing somebody able to express this idea so like succinctly was like, wow. Like,
let me. It's wonderful, and I think we should honor the way that the Du Bois paper is recurring, and this like so the elements there. There's the other who is identified as lacking courage in 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 making another's problem present to them. It took Du Bois' reflection and articulation to become aware that he himself is a problem or is a contradiction. And so he's encountering these questions, and then it comes to that level of articulation for him that gives him the position from which he can identify others as perhaps or lacking courage, but also lacking the articulation. So it's this way in which um and this is also like Nietzsche and honesty is an achievement. You achieve honesty, and because there's like a deep moral dimension to the universe, your honesty and your clarity are usually like pretty close together. So your like ability to be honest is also your ability to be clear about things. So
yeah.
there's like general confusion, and then like it's this but I think the point
I was,
I want to like press into, and just now sharing like a bit of a personal. So I was socializing. It's a braai, and there's a chap who is grunting just in the way he's being, and it's like it's not it's not a reflective. He's not aware of himself, almost like this childlike effusion of noises that because it's a noise, it's audible to everyone that's there, but it's like
are you being
it's,
literal, or are you being metaphorical when you say grunt?
I mean, very, very literal.
Like like like
No,
that.
no, 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 no. So the part of the reason why because breath work is something I've been paid for and that I practice and that I teach sometimes. It's also something that I'm paying attention to a lot, the way that breath is moving for people. And there's certain patterns and uh yeah, it's a very interesting source of information. So maybe I'm just paying attention to it a little bit more than the average person at the Bright. But now, how do I come to this person and make it clear to him or reflect in some way or like why even? Like, what's up with this symptom? You grunting,
Well,
you
the
and I
obvious.
can
Yeah, keep going. Keep going. Sorry.
with like a part of it is like I can totally relate in terms of my own coughing, burping
Mhm,
history,
mhm.
the way I hold my breath in this context, or whatever. But like,
It's what
where's my cause, my reason, my impetus to bring this very personal problem of another just because I can see it into like what's that manner of invitation? Because in some sense, he has to offer that wanting to be, what would it be, like clear, honest, or to have something revealed or exposed or put into consideration. And then how much is it my stepping across, where's the boundary? What is the boundary? Like, am I courageous or just rude? If I'm like, so what is the, like, the boys, what is it like to be a,
Problem.
or now I'm inspired by that, and I go to colored folk or a black person, and I'm like, do you know that you're actually a problem? Like, your being is a contradiction, and I read something, so now like, what am I?
Yeah.
It's
For whom is it to reveal, or for whom is it to pose the question, right? The source of like maybe you are just rude, Dan. Like I don't know. But the source of things is so often important, and I think it's really difficult to find that line. On the one hand, I want to say that insofar as the person, like what you're recognizing in the person, that enables you to see the space for dialogue is their personality, right? That they are a subject, that they can engage with thinking, that they can self reflect, and that's what invites you in. You don't go to like the stone that's just sitting there by itself and ask it questions. Or go, did you know that you're going to be stuck on the ground because gravity is always there, right? You just leave it be. But like the person has the capacity maybe to self reflect, to change, to investigate themselves in interesting ways. And so on the one hand, I think that the personality of the person invites you in. But on the other hand, I think that there is this, you got to know where your bounds are, right? Like, if you just go up to black people telling them that they are a problem, it's going to be weird and strange, especially because the text develops in a way that allows that problem to be maybe overcome or reconciled. But
yes, yeah.
there's the there's also that question of like courage, I guess. Like, and Dr. Bryant, who's teaching this text, is an old white lady, right? She's not a person of color or a black person or something like that, or
Mm,
American. But she just chose the reading, and she's led the class. Like every week, we just throw up questions on the board, so it's like a self leading discussion group, sort of like how these are. And she's found a way to open that space for those of us who are feeling like this or can relate to this, um, to do so while doing it in a not a you're a problem manner, right? Like there's different
mm,
approaches, and I'm thinking maybe of Socrates here and how Socrates starts conversations. Like the way in which he leads into the philosophical discourse is always like on some adjacent tangent. Again, Euthyphro's in the courtroom, he's taking his father to court for murdering a murderer because it's impious to do so. And then Socrates just like starts off on this like, oh, piety, cool. What is that? Right? So there's like some shared third thing between us, some mediating factor that we can bring to the table. When
mm,
uh, so on the one hand, it's like completely open every situation, but on the other, it's a skill that you have to develop of dealing with the individual, like knowing your place, knowing your relation, knowing what you can bring in or how you can bring it in, and where it ought to
yeah,
lead, right? Like the Du Bois book might be a really helpful suggestion. Like you could say something like, you know, I heard from Hadley that this book would be really helpful as like like to think about race and reflect on these ideas. That this book might be an interesting starting point, and then you don't you say it without saying it, almost. And I think a large part of like philosophizing or even getting people interested in philosophizing is figuring out like what's best left unsaid. And
Yes.
might be much to that, right? Like you were just speaking about Larry and how you guys have started this talk about the politics, and what's so strong about the way in which he presents an account is that he can really make present what is absent, what we are
Yes.
missing, or what's incomplete from us, and what we need to find in order to get that account going. And so, in terms of the grunting person at the braai or something like that, it's like
Mm.
figuring out maybe a way to expose incompleteness, uh, but doing so in such a way that they can recognize the incompleteness as an incompleteness and maybe
Yeah.
some sort of completion. I don't think that the grunting is wrong necessarily. Like it's
No.
appropriate here and there, but there is like room to, I think, also just curiosity, maybe, right? Like
Yes. Yeah.
we just strive to know, right? Like why this is the case.
Yeah, what's often most impactful about me or to me about um a friend of wisdom say is that they are cognizant of a scary degree to the implicit goings-ons of relational context, but they don't what's like what often turns out to be most endearing about it is the fact that they don't point to it. So even like there was an ugliness in how I was expressing, even just like pointing the need in me to point to a grunting.
Mhm.
There's something about is in the very gesture of it, like it doesn't contribute to what I'd want to contribute to. There's a way to include it, but not isolate it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this drawing or there's this attractive, there's this like drawing in that is then an open invitation that someone can take without feeling then seen in an uncomfortable way or exposed in some way or reactive or defensive, because now there's a hint of a judgment or a um something something violent essentially about being pointed out or about having something about oneself pointed out. So then the I guess
Were
for
you
me
the
in this
host?
moment,
Were you
yeah.
the host, by the way, of the bride? Were
So
you the host? Were you the
the heart?
host? The host.
No, not really.
Okay. Because I was going to say one of the ways you could break it is to say something like, you could point to him and say, "Hey, do you want a beer? Like I'm going to get one or whatever. You know, would you like some chips or something? Like you pick up the chip, you have some chips, and you pass it around, and then you like pass it to you try and get it to pass to him first, and you just you break that circle. I was just thinking that you break that
Yeah,
ice with him, and then you can kind of like what. What?
What?
No, no, no. That will just be the beginning, and then like something will emerge, you know. Because often, as the point about like starting points that we were like often just beginning. It's like just even in these innocuous ways, it it's like something emerges because you've
Yeah,
begun. Something emerges.
yeah.
I think
That
what
that's kind of that seems like sorry. That seems like what we're pondering. We're pondering like what is that beginning? Like what is the invitation? What is invited? Like and so what's the quality of that? There's this sense in which like it can
You mean
be distorted and almost aggressive, or Thomas, it was sounding passive aggressive. You know, like
what? What?
annoying.
What? Oh,
well,
it's annoying.
I think maybe especially because I've had to do more and more like I've been dealing with classes more and more often. Um, so they're just like my last class was interesting. There were so many different students. There were like 100 students, right? So like you get to see all these different human beings with different interests, fundamentally behaving in different ways and trying to express themselves in different ways. And then, you know, in 3 months or 4 months, they're gone, and a new class comes along, and there's new people to deal with, and new expressions, and new interests, and all of these different things. And I think what's really interesting is that they're all like just fundamentally human, right? The interests that they take up, or the type of interactions that they have, are just fundamentally human. And I think maybe one of the ways of thinking about philosophy that I've been thinking about it recently, especially these great texts like Critique of Pure Reason, or The Souls of Black Folk, or Beyond Good and Evil, or The Republic, is in many ways like art. Uh, like you go to the museum and like there's stuff on the wall, and you can show someone the stuff on the wall. You can't make them like appreciate them, but sometimes an audio guide will help. Sometimes it won't. So it's like figuring out like how to lead a horse to water, right? You can't get it to drink, but you can bandy it down a certain path and lead it to these things that might be interesting to it. And I'm not sure if this universalizing approach that we're even taking here, this conceptual like explanation of how it happens, is possible or is the right thing to be doing, right? It's almost inarticulate, the beginning. Like
Mm.
Arendt has this line in On Revolution, about in the beginning was the word, where she quotes like that Bible phrase. And
The
the
word was with
word,
God. And the word was God.
yeah, but the word is weird, right? Like then, right? There's silence, there's nothingness, and it bursts onto the scene as if though in a moment. And it starts almost from nowhere. I mean, you could say physiologically that it starts from my voice box and my voice cords and the vibrations that I purse my lips to make a certain sound and enter and leave at a certain pitch or something like that. And or you can say that like the conscious processes in my brain have to form some sort of idea of what I want to say. And so there's a bunch of representational content that has to be worked through. You can say all of that, and it's interesting, but there's something almost instantaneous about the word. It just begins.
Mm.
And so the
Yeah.
sort of spontaneity there, the sort of like automatic coming on the theme that happens is just
It all
happens.
begins in a word somewhere.
Yeah. And
Begins in
so,
meaning. I
and
saw this
so,
meaning. I started from there.
yeah, and so I'm wondering about like your relation to the person, Dan. Like you see
Mm.
the person confronts you, it's
Whether you
there.
like it or not.
Like the grunting is going to happen. And one day you'll be at a braai, chowing some meat, trying to chill, and then all of a sudden, up pops the grunting. And
The
now,
grunt.
yeah, and now comes on
Mm.
the moment to reflect, right? And maybe the grunters are a really interesting case because for some reason, you sound particularly perturbed by them. Um, and on the one hand, like the perturbation might be an issue with them, right? There might be something wrong with the way that they're conducting themselves in the social situation. Like, you don't grunt at a bribe, or like, what are you doing? Or like, maybe it's something wrong with you, right? Why are you uncomfortable with the grunting, right? Like, grunting is sometimes an appropriate response to things. Like, I'm just really tired today, and I woke up and I just like yawned and just went like, ugh. That was the only way to articulate precisely what I felt at that moment. If I had said like, guys, I'm just really tired and I can't express how tired I am adequately, that would be much less effective than if I just met the moment wordlessly with just a
With
big
a
eye, right?
big boy grunt.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, this the problem is most
This grunter.
definitely with the
No.
the
Grunting is in public is uncivilized.
it's no, it's I mean, but this is I think the question is then something like how do I relate to the sense of the other suffering something? It's like not only how do I relate, how do I act in relation to or toward? And then it's like, in a sense, if I'm that posture that is non-violent or non-harmful, it's like what is the origin of that, or how is that done? I was speaking to myself.
Has Hadley gone?
Yeah, I think maybe somebody came in, but
I'm sorry, Dan.
this
I'll
no,
be
it's
back in a second. Sorry, I just have to send something.
all good.
I was just doing some folding. I was like listening because you were talking, so I was just like listening.
Yeah, this
Not that what you were saying was uninteresting. It's just like you were talking about how to break that gap, or to approach
no,
someone suffering.
yes, yeah, yeah. Essentially, it seems like the question then is what is the non-harmful thing to do, or how to act in relation to others such that one does not harm oneself or others.
Like, how do you tell someone? I mean, it's almost like, because I mean, there's the very obvious way would be to be, or like the direct way would be to be, mate, what's wrong? You're grunting too much. You're a bit of a grunter. But that's just going to set you up for a confrontation, and it's unempathetic. He might be suffering, as you say. So that's why I suggested. I mean, I think find an icebreaker is what I would say. Find a little, little icebreaker. And then
I get.
And manipulate him into thinking you have a relationship. It's a small manipulation. It's not.
I'm not sure. Sorry, I know I just disappeared, but I'm not sure that Dan's talking about the specific example of the grunter to like ask for social.
Yeah,
like
I get it.
He's interested in the social advice of the situation. Sorry, Thomas, but
the social advice of the situation is to break the ice and create a relationship, build in small ways.
Yeah, I think he's asking something maybe with more, I want to say with more depth, but I don't mean that in a rude way, right? I think he's like asking what allows him to recognize this ability to invade the space, so to speak, or what prompts him in seeing this incompleteness in another, and how to respond to that incompleteness without like misapprehension, right? Because there's always the possibility that you misperceive the incompleteness, right? The grunting again might be appropriate to the situation, right? It might be
it's appropriate. It's appropriate to him. It's in some way just what is happening for him. It's how it's going on. Like so yeah, it's not so much like I'm looking for like a practicality, or like like what to do, like a short a trick. It's because it's driving this question of like because I exhibit when I first brought the example up, like I exhibited a tone almost that revealed the indication of some kind of irritation that would prompt a pointing that is not just a pointing, it's a pointing and a judging. So if I do that, I make the it makes it uncomfortable. Like to have a symptom, to have your symptom pointed out by another, in a sense that symptom is in some way wrong, is uncomfortable, rude.
But it also sounds.
Then you're asking what allows you to. Yeah, keep going. I was going to say the only thing that I can is it compassion that allows you to see, or it's your. You said it was your breathing, your perceptiveness in terms of breathing, because of your work.
So let me just say my question is ultimately uh uh how do I make time for philosophy in that context? That maybe like it sounds a little bit silly, that question, but it's like I think it's relevant. Like how do I make time there?
Yeah,
Which
no,
is the
I think we were like, I think we've been getting caught up a little bit in the particular. And I think that reframing in terms of the general, how to make time for philosophy in that case is revealing because I was thinking about it in terms of like curiosity, right? Like you're curious about this, and like the irritation is a sign of curiosity. I mean, it might be a bad sign. And we were talking about the recognition of incompleteness earlier, right? Like something about you sees that there's something maybe wrong or incomplete about the situation. And I said that the grunter might be more complete, right? Like he might be appropriately responding to the situation. And so, in one way, maybe it's rude to go up and ask, but you got to really think about who the rudeness is towards, right? Is the rudeness towards the grunter or is it the rudeness towards yourself? Does your soul want to find out something about the way that it's responding or thinking about the interaction that you're having and what sort of interaction is appropriate? What you're questioning is some sort of like social norm or some sort of good or something like that. And so sometimes it's difficult. And again, use your judgment is all I can say. Uh, but I think what you're talking about is this making time for philosophy by being attentive, being open, being honest, being earnest, and being aware, and really just bringing yourself to bear on something. There's something maybe worse about you talking about the grunter behind his back than just like going up to, sorry dad, you're a terrible person. Then rather than just going up to the grunter and just having a conversation with him and like mutually trying to come to some sort of understanding, right? Like the dialogue that can happen in that space, if it does happen, like it might not always work out, but there's room for dialogue, and there's like interesting space to start philosophizing, right? Like whenever there's an uncomfortableness, like whenever there's like an irritation, that's the room for philosophizing. It means that like the curiosity is opened up and that there's a space to see, am
yes.
I wrong about this or am I right? And if so, why is this different, right? Like what's happening to prompt this differentness? So maybe just the recognition of difference, right? Like somehow you recognize a difference and you see that difference as disconcerting. And what you want is not difference, you want some sort of identity or something like that, if we're speaking in philosophical terms. But the difference disrupts, right? It shows up and like a flash uh, forces you to interact with it. Um, and so I think that's really the making time that's happening there, right? This presencing of difference um, is a showing itself which enables you to think about it and ultimately either unify it in some sort of like overarching scheme, right? Like to see the grunter as like part of humanity, whatever this uh, to see them as expressing themselves is one way of theorizing it, which recognizes them as part of a larger whole and part of doing something appropriate. But to see them as not part of humanity is equally a theorizing act, right? It's to exclude them from the rational part of the rational animal, right? It's to say animal rather than rational animal. So, like in in your very interaction with them or lack thereof, there's a sort of theoretical element that comes into play, right? You're categorizing, you're working with these concepts, and all of this is implicit. But the conversation opens up the chance for explicit uh, discussion of these ideas, and it allows for a space for interruption, right? Maybe there's a reason that they're doing that. Maybe there isn't, and that's what's on the table to explore. I think that making time for philosophy is like the people that are really good at making time for philosophy, and this is where I was talking about like Dr. Bryant's opening me up to new spaces for philosophizing, the plants, the American Revolution. The people that are really good at philosophizing, I think, are those that are good at finding premises. And finding premises or starting points is like being attentive, right? Just like they're all around us in some weird way. It's just like shifting your focus or having your focus shifted. Um, and it's difficult to say what summons you, right? Like, but something summons and you can respond or not respond. But I think what philosophy does, and to bring it back to the initial conversation, right? Like a big text like Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, which is dense and difficult. I said the preface that we're about to read next week is like 7 pages, but it feels like 700. Um, is opening up that moment to pause, to consider without judgment, to suspend judgment. So in the grunter example, you talked about the sort of like judging feeling that you had. And one of the things that was so beneficial of working with Kant was when I started, I completely disagreed with everything that Kant was saying. And like I did my thesis on Kant partially on like a dare because Larry was like, "You're a Kantian." And in my mind, I was like, "Of course I'm not. Don't be ridiculous." Um, so like this disagreement allowed for me to like take up the challenge and work within that space. And doing so allowed me to appreciate it. And I think the like one of the big influences here, at least at this university, has been Ed Helper, who I shared that talk with you guys the other day. And he's just been a master at like appreciating things. Like one of the students said, like he's the king of strongmanning. Like he can strongman any argument into like something so powerful that you'll never be able to knock it down. But he's
Mm.
also the king of like knocking down those strongman arguments. So like, I don't know, you read someone like a Locke or something like that, and in philosophy, it sometimes happens that like you get used to certain accounts and you get stuck in your ways, and you're like, this empiricism stuff just doesn't. It's just not. It doesn't work the same way, or it doesn't do what it's supposed to be doing. But what is it supposed to be doing, right? Like it's its own thing. It has its own sort of unity, and part of being like good at the subject matter is pausing, taking a step back, seeing what that underlying unity is, or that like seeing what the arguments are actually for, and then after one has come to an appreciation of them, subjecting them to scrutiny, right? Like being uh, aware of them and then becoming self-aware to such a level where you can say, oh, this is actually not that good, or oh, this is actually like not that interesting, but it's worthwhile. And I think you can find that in texts like the one that we're doing now, or you can find that in people, right? There are parts of people that are really worthwhile to appreciate, and I think that like everybody has those parts, and there are some parts that are maybe disconcerting and should be let go uh, for them in order to be the type of thing that they are. And I think what's like what good people do, or what good philosophy does, is that it opens up a space for self-interrogation to figure out what's serving you and what's serving the sort of knowledge framework that you are working within, and also being able to like organize and structure yourself in a way that is maybe more true to the things at issue, right? Whether it be your self-identity or your relationship with the world or how you behave at a braai. Um, all of these things are essential to the type of thing that you are. And doing philosophy really opens up that space to figure out which ones serve you and which ones don't.
Mhm.
Yeah, sticking with it is difficult, right? Like the big texts, the big concepts, the stupidly large words sometimes, all the jargon. is dissuasive. Like talking about Kant to a normal person like who doesn't read Kant is difficult because there's these big terms like synthesis a priori or determinative judgment and all of these.
Architectonic.
Yeah, they fall flat on the ears, right? Like they don't have the ring of something exciting unless you've been through the system. Um, so it's about, I guess, finding a way to let yourself figure those things out and then maybe to invite curiosity from others, to open up a space where they can be curious about whatever they need to be curious about. Ultimately, they'll probably be something else, but that's cool. All that's important is that they are wondering, right? That they are reflecting on themselves. I can't tell you what to reflect on, right? I just
Mm.
can aid you in your reflection here and there.
That seems like a good point to end the conversation on, or at least from my perspective. You ended that with a beautiful rhetorical aplomb, Hadley.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think I'm in agreement there. Um, sure. Did we make time? I'm not sure. But
We made 2 hours. We're just shy of
oh
2
yeah,
hours.
yeah.
We do have to
All
kind of
around.
keep these things because otherwise they can stretch on. But if you guys
Yeah.
want to carry, I think I probably need to go and make supper now. So
Yeah, I need to be out by 6.
Hadley,
I'm at work as well, guys.
okay.
So
Yeah. Eddie, 12 o'clock
Look
there now,
after
eh?
yourself, hey guys.
like 11. Yeah.
Um,
You
you'll
do
send
come.
us, you'll send us yeah, maybe like what was the word you used, Tom? A good close, a plum. The
No, I
Yeah,
think it means like a certain gravitas. I haven't actually. I learned a lot of my words from context, not from dictionaries.
yes, yes, yeah, sure. Yeah,
Self-confidence, especially when in a demanding situation. Oh,
Yeah, I think
I would
so,
have gone with a problem if I'd known it was with self-confidence. I wouldn't have used that. I would have used more of a word of kind of completeness, roundness.
so I've
maybe,
just read
yeah,
the preface. Let me just say
Hmm?
a word or two about the preface before we all leave.
Oh,
So I've
sorry.
read the preface, and this sort of a question will come up in the preface. How do we
yeah,
interact with others? How do we make space and time for philosophizing?
yeah,
It's not explicitly addressed, I don't think. Kant is not going to give us a step by step break the ice with a gentle reminder. But he is going to talk about different philosophical positions that have happened throughout the history, right? Dogmatism, skepticism, indifferentism, all of these views that have come on the scene. And Kant is really interesting because he is aware that they're all doing something that might be thought of as partially correct. But just insofar as it's partially correct, it's completely wrong. Right?
yeah,
So we are going to be reading the preface, and in the preface, he will start to distinguish the critical position from the previous philosophers that have been on the scene. Um, and you might want to focus on, or what you might want to think about while you read the preface is how is he working with them, right? Like philosophy, especially philosophy texts, have a certain way of relating to others, right? And I think Kant has a very interesting way of relating to others and other philosophical positions, especially in the preface, that he's doing
mm,
something that is valuable because not only because of the vast philosophical power and the concepts that he brings to bear on philosophy itself, but just in the way in which he approaches other positions. It's somewhat unlike many philosophers do. And I want to say it's very different to maybe how philosophy is done in certain parts today. Um, so,
Mm.
yeah, keep it in mind as we read through the text, because Kant is going to bring in philosophers for inspiration who he almost completely disagrees with, but sees some value in them. Like Hume plays an integral role in Kant's philosophical system, but only because Hume didn't really hit the mark, right? So there's a sort of fostering of something that is like you can see what somebody else is aiming at, and then you can bring that into fruition. And to do that is really a difficult and worthwhile skill to acquire.
Bringing
Yeah.
fragments into the system.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. Having a sense of what um what a breath feels like, and then when you hear the labor of another's breathing, and you want to intervene in some way because you can feel that um laboring, really, which and it's a is enough to be like a end of life symptom. Many people report when they are with people who are dying. It's like oh, I know that suffering. I know there's a telos almost to a released breath. So
Mm-hmm.
how can I work with and from that symptom? How symptomatic do I need to become? My I uh I have a cough that really irritates people. When I go on walks around the neighborhood, it sets the dogs off, and it's been a long process of coming to terms with the way in which it operates in this unconscious. Symptoms are always productive to push into, but it's always uncomfortable. And our sense of timing, our sense of time, I think maybe this at least my conclusion, I think is really tied up with our symptoms, or how we how we appear and time our lives, and our sense of being related carries with it the sense of time. Like I I can't enjoy or savor this, so there's this slight rush in it, the slight rush, or the slight like spatial pullback from turns into an old age of like jitteriness, or but we exceeding the yaponomics, I think.
The aponomics.
Yeah, the yapology. the
Yeah,
the bad
apology. Please
the
apologize for your puns.
Yeah, I think
uh
stuff that we may return to. It's maybe unlikely that we will during the course of it in this direct manner. We might not be approaching how to how to philosophize, how to spend time, what is spending time, what is the timeless feeling that one gets when one is enjoying what one's doing, right? Like we've gotten lost for 2 hours on something, and there's this sort of timelessness to this activity. Um, these are indirect questions, I think, that will maybe be prompted by the text that we'll be going through. They're,
labor, yeah.
yeah, I sort of, in this way, I am pretending to lead the horses to water, so to speak. We'll get there, and the water will be different from what you expect. But
Nay,
insofar
nay,
as it
Hadley,
serves
nay,
you to
nay.
think that we're going to, insofar as it
Nay.
serves you to think that we'll be talking about this more often, and insofar as that helps as an aid to reading Kant to have these questions in mind, because I think they are implicitly like background questions that might be brought to bear. Good. Right?
Moi.
Nay, nay.
Okay, no. There we go.
All right, guys.
I think we should stop horsing around, guys.